A very warm welcome to this introduction to design psychology, a little taster lecture. My name is Nejra van Zalk, and I will be guiding you through what on earth I mean by design psychology, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the kind of work that we do and why it's important to understand humans when it comes to engineering. And so you may ask yourself, what does a psychologist do at an engineering department? But believe it or not, it's actually a really great place to work when you are a psychologist, because there is a lot of new technologies and a lot of innovation happening. And that's exactly the right place where I'd like to be, because that allows me to understand and study people and how they react to development and innovation of technologies. So I'm an associate professor or senior lecturer in psychology and human factors at the Dyson School of Design Engineering. I have a research group there that's called the Design Psychology Lab, where we together work on trying to understand what psychological mechanisms govern how people behave and how they feel when they engage with technologies. So how can we design products and services and interventions that might benefit mental health? And I study human technology interaction a lot. A lot of it is focused on digital technologies, but also other types of technologies. And I also study things like how psychopathology, such as anxiety or depression, develops across the lifespan. So in my lab, for example, we develop VR interventions that help different aspects of mental health. I also collaborate with roboticists. We've been developing a robotic patient that responds to palpation by GP trainees, and I've been working on the kind of emotive facial aspect of this robotic patient. So there's a lot of really cool intersection between psychology and engineering, and that's the kind of work that we do generally in Dyson School of Design Engineering. In truth, right, most of us are kind of amateur psychologists, and what I mean by that is that we tend to think a lot about what other people do, what they think. We try and explain their behavior. We try and explain our behavior. We analyze things in detail. We might have lots of thoughts about, someone's crossing the street and they look at us and they smile, and we might, surmise why they're smiling. So we might think, oh gosh, they fancy me, or you might think, oh, do we know each other? Why are they smiling? Or, if you're having a particularly bad day, you might be thinking, why on earth are they smiling? Do I have something between my teeth? So we're all thinking about other human beings all the time. This is referred to as folk or amateur psychology. And it's using beliefs and desires that you have yourself to explain other people's behavior. So it's the information that kind of lay people have about the mind and the behavior. And there's nothing wrong with this. We all engage with it all the time. I do it myself. I don't want to sort of knock that on any level. That's your own personal perception of what it is, of your human experience, right? But that's not quite what we do when we study psychology at large, or design psychology as well in particular. So I took a definition. I was trying to understand, when I started working at the Department of Design Psychology, I was trying to understand, where do psychology and design kind of merge, and how can we study them and combine them? And so American Psychological Association, one of the biggest associations of psychologists, they define psychology as the study of the mind and behavior. Actually, any textbook that you might come across, this is exactly what you're going to get. And that means studying everything from the actual brain in neuroscience to how crowds and nations behave. It's studying anything from babies and toddlers and how they develop, to caring for the aged. And you can find psychologists in every conceivable setting. So, for example, I'm a researcher and I work as a researcher in psychology, but you will find psychologists in mental health care services. And what we kind of do, right, is we try to understand behavior. And I'll get to that a little bit more later as well. Now, design is an interesting one. What is design? Charles Eames was a very cool designer. Actually, if you don't know who he is, you can Google Eames and chair, and you're going to see some beautiful examples of chairs that he designed. And he described design as a plan for arranging elements to accomplish a particular purpose, which I think is a really profound way of thinking about it. So you're putting together certain things in a certain way because you want to achieve an outcome. And that outcome might be, for example, that you want people to sit comfortably. In my instance, I'm trying to arrange elements to accomplish a particular purpose of good well-being and good mental health. So that's how I think about design psychology. It's a process for arranging elements to accomplish maintaining and increasing mental health. And when I say mental health, by the way, I mean that in the same sense as I would talk about physical health. So how do we do this typically in psychology? Well, we will always start with describing a particular phenomenon, right? So we might notice, for example, let's give the example of, you might have noticed that when you go on a bus and there's only one other person sitting on the bus, and you're the other person as well going onto the bus, you would actually never go and sit next to this other person. In fact, you might feel really strange if you did that, and the other person might feel that you're strange as well, right? So I might have seen this phenomenon and I might be wondering, gosh, why is that, right? So I described a phenomenon. Basically, people will try and move as far away from each other if they're in an enclosed space, rather than sit next to each other and talk. And then I might ask myself, why? So I'm trying to understand why this is. And I might be using existing theories that help to explain behavior in enclosed spaces, or social behavior, or behavior between, individuals or whatever. But if there are no existing hypotheses or well-tested theories, then I might have to generate my own theories to try and understand. So I might have this idea, I might hypothesize that the reason people don't do this is because we have social norms, and it would be breaking a social norm to come and sit next to a stranger and start talking to them, right? So this is why we might then go all the way to the other end of the bus and sit by ourselves and scroll on our phone. What happens when I understand this behavior? If I've tested my hypothesis and I've proven my theory, I can then predict when this happens, and maybe for whom as well. It might not be the case for all people, and that might not be the case for all types of buses, right? And if I can predict behavior, I can influence it, which means that I can change it. So let's say that I want to design an intervention when I get perfect strangers to, instead of sitting across from each other far away on a bus, I want to design an intervention that helps them to actually get to know each other while they're taking a bus ride. So I might, for example, design little, let's say little signs that somebody might be able to activate when they take a seat that says, if you're sitting alone, come next to me, I'm open for a chat, or something like that. And so that might be inviting, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how we start off with psychological science and how we do things. And so we really describe our users, the people, we describe them first, right? This is very different to how people often do things when they are designing products or new services. It's a very different process. I'll give you an example of how it might work when people are designing a new product, okay? So a typical design process might start with a product idea. A couple of people might have an idea about, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have some kind of device that can take me from A to B in a city really quickly, and it would be small and it wouldn't take up too much space. I might be able to charge it, quickly, and it would be not very costly for me to do it. Wouldn't that be amazing? So they start chatting about that, and then they, might write some simulation tests, prototyping. They might develop a prototype that they test with a couple of friends or a couple of other people. And, there's a long process to get to that. And then they manufacture the product, and voila, you have an electrical scooter. And there's your scooter, right? And a scooter is a fantastic piece of kit. And the idea behind the scooters is really, really amazing. It's then sold to people, and people kind of adapt to the product. However, where this hasn't taken into account is how people might be using the scooter. So we all have heard and seen that people can get really upset at scooter drivers, right? Because scooter drivers have been involved in accidents. They tend to leave them around like litter, so they don't actually put them in the place where they're supposed to go. So people get really annoyed to find electrical scooters on pavements, and they can't walk properly. And I don't think the guys that came up with this idea about the scooter really thought about this, because, you know, they wouldn't have, right? They didn't really necessarily think about how do people behave in traffic? How do people move around when they use, you know, infrastructure out in the world? There's really good examples of when you kind of ignore human behavior at your peril when you're a designer. A great case study of that is, for example, the London Millennium Bridge, which opened, some of you might remember this, but for many of you, you might be too young to remember it, but it was meant to kind of commemorate the start of the millennium. And so it opened in June 2000. And embarrassingly enough, it had to close very quickly, because despite being a very beautiful piece of, you know, architectural work, it turns out that the bridge was swaying very ominously. It was kind of moving in a way, when people were walking across it, it was moving very, very uncomfortably, and people freaked out. And actually, on the day of the opening, the bridge was crossed by 90,000 people, and up to 2,000 people would be on the bridge at a time. And where the maths behind the bridge were absolutely perfect and spot on, what they hadn't done is compensate for the fact that when people move together, there's something that happens that's called a positive feedback phenomenon. It's a natural sway motion of people. It introduces sideways oscillations in a bridge. And this causes people to sway in steps. So subconsciously, people start to sway in step with each other. And this increases the amplitude of the bridge oscillations and effectively makes the bridge really, really wobbly. Nobody thought about this. And of course, then they had to go back, close the bridge, and compensate for this. There's many examples of when designers and innovators and engineers don't necessarily consider the human and the way that human behaves in a certain context. You know, and people will often use technologies in very unintended ways. One great area of interest for me regarding using technologies in not intended ways is actually all manner of digital technology. So I'll give you another example of, for example, laptops or personal computers. They don't have to be laptops, but let's say personal computers. These are absolutely widely available products that most people have. We're very dependent on them. We love using them. Most of us have our whole life kind of linked to a computer. So we might have our photos and our schoolwork and our other work and whatnot. And when the personal computer was designed, it was designed actually to help people with word processing and with making quicker calculations, right? But what's happened today, because of such advances in this technology, is that your laptop or your computer has now taken over so many functions in life that you would have done in other ways. So this funny cartoon talks about how way back when, you know, you'd go to cinema to watch a movie, you'd phone people up to have a chat with them, you might read the news by yourself on a bench or in a cafe, you'd listen to music by going to a concert, you might work on stuff in the library, you might just goof off on a beach, you know, lay around in the park and read a book. And all of these things can now be done in front of your computer, right? And so that is the progress that we have. So this probably wasn't the intended use of the computer, but there's no doubt that this is actually what's happened. And so where I'd like to take this lecture is have us to all to think about, you know, how much control we have over using many of these technologies. I'll focus on digital technologies, like I said today, but there's many products that I could use as example as well. So we really don't often have much say, right? We're all dependent on using technologies. We have to use them in our schoolwork or in our job. We have to use them to communicate with friends. Most of us might buy products because we've seen it in a TV ad, or we might have seen a friend that has the latest phone, or we might just have the phone that we can afford because we can't afford a better one. So, you know, and we have the technologies that we have, and we use them in the way that we use them, but you will hardly have failed noticing that many people do actually report that they struggle with their devices. You know, and there's even chat about smartphone addiction and things like that. This is very debatable, but there's no doubt that many people, you know, when I speak anecdotally to students, they'll say, yeah, I really struggle putting away my phone, or I struggle turning my laptop off in the evening, and I'm really trying, but I always find that there's something else to do. And one of the problems that happens is basically when humans meet technology, right? This was perfectly encapsulated in a wonderful quote by a famous biologist and naturalist called Edward O. Wilson, who said once that the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And what he meant by this is that we have, our emotional systems as we are, they are a product of millennia worth of evolution. But we have this fight or flight response, which basically it's kind of like we're still living on the prairie, and our emotional systems are tuned into detecting danger or fleeing from danger. So sometimes we get stressed over nothing. Sometimes we get stressed over things that are really dangerous. Sometimes we don't get stressed when we should get stressed. So our emotions are very ancient. At the same time, we live in these, we live and work and do our daily business using these medieval institutions like schools and organizations and associations and various institutions, lots of bureaucracy, and things need to be done a certain way, right? We have to apply for things, and et cetera, et cetera. And into the mix, you can throw in this, what he calls godlike technology. And what he means by that, of course, is that for most of us, it's magic. A smartphone is magical because we don't know how it works. We have no idea how to fix one. If it breaks, we have to get it elsewhere for somebody else to fix it for us. And for many people, where you have a large gap between understanding a technology and the use of the technology, for them, it's almost like, flying unicorns. Most of us will have had grandparents who are actually, my father was in absolute awe that you could have a calculator on a smartphone. He was absolutely, awestruck by this because he thought this was so cool, because in his days, calculators were these big bricks that you kind of had to buy specially and use. So the fact that we have humans in the mix with this technology does actually produce a lot of interesting challenges. And thinking back to, last year with the advent of large language models like ChatGPT and all of this that's happening right now, it's really becoming clear that the technological innovation that's happening is a little bit too fast compared to what humans are able to process and deal with. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing that people are reporting when it comes to technology is to do with a concept called autonomy. I'll talk about that a lot today. It's one of the most important developmental tasks, a core task that we kind of, as we develop as human beings, we develop autonomy. This is also known as self-ruling or agency. It's whether or not we allow external factors to influence how we behave. It's also known as independence. So basically, people who act independently without relying on others, right? And when we're teeny tiny as toddlers and babies, we're completely reliant and dependent on our parents, and they do everything for us. And as we're growing up, we're becoming increasingly independent to a point where we become, hopefully well-functioning individuals. The opposite of autonomy, when defined as independence, would be dependence or sort of complete reliance on others, right? And this is just our capacity to make informed, uncoerced decisions, basically. It's part of executive functioning in the brain. So it's a system of brain functions that is related to things like planning and decision making and impulse control and problem solving and things like that. And like I said, this is hugely important as we're growing up. So what we want to do is go from completely dependent to fully independent. This is also related to good mental health later in life. And if we feel that we have autonomy, we also feel that we are in control of our life. Whether or not you agree with this, in terms of philosophy is a different question. But people will say that they feel they can make their own choices. So they choose where to study, they choose who their friends are, they choose their loved ones in many respects, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what happens when we remove autonomy from people? When you lack autonomy, you are more controlled by what others do, what they think and feel. You adapt to them. You react to and you worry about someone else's feelings and opinions. You might have trouble making decisions and taking action on your own, and you are instead much more easily influenced by others. And this can help reinforce poor self-esteem. So in fact, lack of autonomy and poor self-esteem can cause, in turn, many symptoms of poor mental health. For example, stress, worry and anxiety, learned helplessness, which is a feeling of, just kind of breaking down and not being able to do anything, which is linked to depression, feelings of guilt, trouble communicating, but also actually antisocial problems, things like anger and addiction, and even domestic abuse, emotional abuse, etc. So there's a lot of bad things that are related to people not being in control of their lives. So going back to what I was talking about, how we have these godlike technologies that now exist, how is the advent of these technologies related to whether or not they support our autonomy? I have a number of concerns about this, and I'm going to throw them at you today, and I'd love to hear what you think at the end of this lecture. I'll give you three that are particularly disturbing to me. We have a lot of wonderful digital systems, but the question is whether they are actually supportive of our autonomy. I'll give you the example of Google. You are probably not old enough. I am old enough to have been around when Alta Vista was a famous search engine that was pretty rubbish. And then Google came, and Google is an absolutely fantastic search tool, right? It gives you exactly what you want, and it appears very smart because it sort of learns from you. So let's say that I'm hankering for some wonderful Lebanese food this evening, and I will tell Google to find me a Lebanese restaurant near to where I live, and it's going to do that. It's going to figure out, because it's already learned from me, so it knows where I live. It finds me a number of restaurants. It shows me, the star ratings, and then I can figure out where do I go and have a nice meal this evening. So when used that way, it's a fantastic tool. But let's say I want to use Google to learn something new, such as, for example, I'm doing research. If I do a search for scientific studies or topics that I want to study, my Google search results will be different to a friend of mine's who's doing the same thing. They're searching for the same thing. The reason being that Google is adapted to me and what I have already searched for. That's a very different process to, for example, walking into a library and reading old papers and coming across new ideas and thoughts that you haven't thought about. In fact, that's how a lot was done when I was an undergraduate student. So you got to read a lot, and some of it wasn't relevant, and some of it was amazing because it really opened your eyes. So you would come across new information you wouldn't otherwise. So this is a really big concern for me, because a lot of these systems are super convenient to a point where they're actually hampering the development of human autonomy. Okay. Another concern is issue of privacy. So the fact that we have all of these devices and they are increasingly interconnected, that's super convenient, right? I have an iWatch, I have an iPhone, I have a MacBook Air, and they all work seamlessly together and they're interconnected. However, they do collect a lot of data, and all of these devices that we have that are smart devices in our homes are collecting data about us continuously, to a degree where companies can now find out very, very intimate things about you that you may not feel comfortable sharing. Let's say this person here in the image has a smart fridge that shows that they only have junk food in the fridge. They have a smart Hoover, a vacuum cleaner, that hasn't been used in weeks, meaning that they may not necessarily be taking care of their home. Their smart mattress shows that they spend their entire days in bed because they're not really moving from out of the bed. Their smart lighting system doesn't turn on throughout the day, which would imply that they just lay there in bed in the dark, right, all day long. And their smart hairbrush hasn't been used for ages. It's not turned on, which would imply a loss of kind of personal hygiene. Now, if I'm a company that has hold of all this information, I could very quickly deduce that this person is either ill or perhaps going through a depressive episode. And then I may send them adverts on their phone that, for example, tell them about new depression medication, or even worse, about drinking alcohol, right? I could say, "Ooh, have you tried this beer?" And that is a person who's vulnerable in that situation who really shouldn't be drinking alcohol. If you think that what I'm talking about is a bit dystopian, it's actually already happened. So this is an example that was described in Forbes magazine. The Target, which is a huge American company that sell all manner of things. There was a girl that was using their search algorithm on their website. She was searching for kind of different types of strange foods. And the algorithm on the website was very clever and deduced that the person in question must be pregnant, and therefore automatically sent to her home a maternity catalog for clothing. And her father freaked out because this was a teenage girl. Her father freaked out, got very upset, called the company and said, how dare you? We don't have anyone who's pregnant here. Why would you send this information, whatnot? And then it turns out that, in fact, she was pregnant. And my understanding is she didn't know it either. So this is pretty sensitive information that has been, conveyed to a company inadvertently. You didn't mean to tell them that you might be pregnant. She didn't mean to do that. That just happened because the systems were so smart and there was nothing put in place to stop that from happening. So the system really removed the autonomy of this person to make her own decision about, first of all, finding out in the first place, and second of all, deciding who to tell second, right? And the third concern that I'm going to highlight related to autonomy is if we continuously then impair people's autonomy in life, okay? If all we're doing is making these systems more and more convenient, we can do everything with a simple click and everything can be super easy. Are we, in effect, impairing people's ability to make our own choices and therefore damaging our own concept of our free will? A free will is a philosophical concept, but we would all like to think that we actually have, that our will is free and that we can make our own decisions, even if that's not always the case in all circumstances and in all contexts. But on this slide, I've shared images from WALL-E, which is, I'm sure you must have seen it. If you haven't, do watch it. It's a fantastic flick by Disney, which is a very kind of dystopian idea about this little robot who lives on Earth and collects trash, and the humanity is gone into a spaceship, and the humanity is basically a bunch of people who are now so comfortable and so convenient that all they do is sit in these chairs. They don't move. They just drink shakes all day long to give themselves nourishment. They don't know how to make food or grow food anymore, and they communicate to each other via these kind of screens, holographic screens, even if they sit next to each other, right? And we could laugh at that. We might find that to be really, really funny. But, it's not actually too far removed from what I'm talking about, because, clearly one of the issues here is that people have become way too comfortable. And the question with all of these digital systems and products is if they are helping to coddle, especially young people, into not being able to make up their own minds about things. And, are these systems providing possibilities for us to develop what's known as heterodoxy, which is the capability of holding differing views in your mind? And, actually your mind won't explode if you have them, knowing that the reality of things is not black and white. It's not so simple. So there are things that we have to consider that are concerning with the way that technologies are being used. And again, that's not to say that these technologies were designed to be used this way, right? Nobody sat down and decided that they would make, a Google search because they really wanted people to become less autonomous. Quite the opposite. They wanted to create a better life for people and make information more freely and readily available. But there's always downsides to how people use technologies. So then you might ask yourself, okay, so what on earth can we do about this? Is there anything to do? And some people will say, okay, so we may want to design better products. I'll get to that. We might want to design them differently and do things differently. We may also want to regulate. We may want to introduce legislation where the government steps in and says, a company can or can't do this. And if products are bad for people, maybe we try and remove them. But that's, more easily said than done. A third way of thinking about it as well is how can we design products that kind of are infused to motivate people to make better choices. So if we have a product that we intend for people to use in a certain way, how can we ensure that we motivate people to use the product in that way and not in a way that wasn't intended? So a solution to some of these problems might be introducing motivation by designs. We can motivate people to make better decisions about the products and services they use by building in certain things, certain cues for them. And this means designing technologies in a different way from the start, right? Because these technologies would need to be designed to help people to make better decisions in their daily life and not to overuse them. Now, motivation is super related to autonomy. You might have heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs before, for example, as a way to help explain what motivates people to behave in a certain way. This is probably the world's most famous and actually the world's least empirically tested framework that helps to explain motivation. The idea that Maslow proposed, he was a sociologist way back when, and he proposed this notion that your kind of lower needs are the most important. So sleeping, eating, physiological needs, are trump everything else. And unless these needs are filled, you can't achieve the more higher up needs like love and belonging or self-esteem, or even things like self-actualization or self-fulfillment. Now, most researchers who've tested this theory have found it unscientific, and there is recent evidence about kind of mixed findings about this theory. So it's not actually something that I think is necessarily useful for explaining what motivates people, because we also know that people will choose, for example, love and belonging over things like eating and sleeping, right? So certain needs can, in some contexts, trump others. So it's not kind of quite linear as was proposed here. Yet this typical framework is very famous and does tend to linger. It proliferates pretty strongly everywhere. Instead, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is motivation, right? And how can we help to explain it? So, we tend to think of it as a continuum. So either you're motivated or you're not motivated, and you can be somewhere in between, right? So it kind of presumes that there's a continuum there. But just because I'm motivated, does that impact the quality of my behavior? So a great example of this that many of us might identify with is we might go, I'd love to have a six-pack for Beach 2024. And I'm going to sign up to the gym. And gosh, I'm going to go to the gym several times a week. And I'm going to work hard. And I'm going to get that six-pack. And come next summer, I'm going to look amazing on the beach, right? So that would be high motivation. However, you'll find that even when people are highly motivated, they don't actually necessarily behave to help support the final outcome. So people will just stop going to the gym, or they'll go more rarely. Their gym membership will lapse. They'll come up with loads of excuses. And if you ask them, well, what about your six-pack? Aren't you motivated to get Yes, I am, they'll say. I'm really motivated to get that six-pack. But just because you're motivated doesn't mean that you're actually going to do what needs to be done to get there. So the quantity of motivation isn't necessarily impacting the quality of behavior. So there may actually be different types of motivation that help to explain why we behave in certain ways. I can give you an example of two extremes as well that help to demonstrate this point. So here is, you might have heard of him, David Blaine. He's an American illusionist and endurance artist. He's fantastic. Here is him standing on a 100-foot pillar in Bryant Park, New York City. He stayed for a day and a half. He just stood there on the pillar, and then he jumped off. He does a lot of these kinds of stunts. He's been squeezed into a block of ice, and he was in water for I don't know how long where he couldn't breathe. So he does a lot of these. But there we're talking about, wow, what motivates someone like David Blaine to actually do this, right? What's the motivation here? Might be very high, but what kind of motivation does he have to do these kind of type? Here is an example of students, and I've been there myself, where you might have loads of deadlines and the time is ticking away and there's lots to do and you're really stressed, yet you find yourself procrastinating your schoolwork and you're watching Netflix instead, or staring aimlessly at the wall, and you're just not doing what you're supposed to do. And it's not because you hate your studies or because you just don't necessarily find them enjoyable, but your motivation is somehow the behavior linked to your motivation is somehow lacking. So this leads me to how we think about motivation today more clearly. So people not only have different amounts, they also have different types or kinds of in motivation. There is intrinsic motivation, which refers to doing something because you just find it inherently interesting or enjoyable. Most of us will have something like this. We might love playing the piano or cello. We might love football or rugby. We might love reading, whatever it is. Nobody has to remind us to do it. We just love doing it, and we love spending time with it. We learn a lot and we get better, and that gives us a kick and all that. Then there's also extrinsic motivation, which is doing something because it leads to separate outcome. Such as, for example, you might sign up for a certain higher education course because you want to get a good job and get a lot of money. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. People used to knock down extrinsic motivation, but there's also different degrees of extrinsic motivation that are, some of them are not very good, but some of them can be pretty good. So extrinsic motivation is not inherently bad. Let's put it that way. It's just that intrinsic motivation is really the one that really makes you do things without, too much kind of effort. There's no external reward linked to it. The reward is internal. It comes from within. You just enjoy doing it. And we know from lots of research in educational settings that when children are intrinsically motivated, for example, to read, they will have a deeper understanding of what they're reading. And people who are intrinsically motivated to study, they have a greater comprehension and text recall. Or it's also associated with things like greater creativity and more flexible problem solving and innovation and things like that. So it's really, really beneficial for us. So how could we harness this? How could we stimulate people to be intrinsically motivated to use products that we design in a way that we want them to do, so that they end up with good mental health, high level of control and autonomy, and we put them in a good place rather than make them feel like they're getting addicted to devices? How do we stimulate intrinsic motivation? There are good theories about how we can do this. A famous one is self-determination theory by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci, which is a theory of kind of motivation, personality, and development in general. And there are a number of assumptions here, but the most fundamental assumptions is that humans have three basic needs that need to be fulfilled in order for us to be intrinsically motivated. Okay. One is competence. We all want to feel like we can do things. We also like to feel that we're getting better at things, right? So when we start doing something, we start learning a new skill, and then after a while we notice, wow, I'm really getting better at that we get a kick out of that. We love feeling confident. It's a human thing. Human beings also need relatedness. We have a need to be connected to others. That's not necessarily to say that we have to be in the same room as someone, right? We may join a chess club, and we love the idea of playing chess with a computer, but we also like the idea of relating to a community of chess players, which we may do online or in a club or whatever. So it's not necessarily that you're being social there. It's that you can relate to others who have the same experience as you. And then finally, this very important autonomy. We all have a need to be in control over our own life. Nobody likes to feel like they're losing control. If they are, like I said to you way back when, it can be related to a bunch of poor outcomes. So if we satisfy these needs, we can stimulate intrinsic motivation and well-being. So as you can see in this picture, the children who are doing karate, right? They are constantly increasing their competence. They're getting better and better in karate the more they practice it. They can relate to each other on a sort of community level. They might hang out in class. They might even start hanging out outside of karate class. And primarily, they can be in control over the situation and, when they take part and what they do. And that it helps to intrinsically motivate them to do karate. So this theory hypothesizes that if we create social contexts that support these basic needs, this will help to serve to maintain or even enhance intrinsic motivation. And then the vice versa is true as well, right? If we don't have systems that help stimulate these three things, competence, relatedness, and autonomy, then people will probably lose any kind of intrinsic motivation if they had any in the beginning, and they will just not want to do what you want them to do, right? So we could use this as designers, as innovators of technologies. We need to design for intrinsic motivation so that people would use our devices that we make in the way that we intend. So as I've tried to demonstrate here is that we can use lessons from psychology to help us design products that won't impair our autonomy. So we might, for example, start thinking about how do we design non-addictive smartphones? And we can do this while still thinking about creating very sought after products that people want to use. So this isn't necessarily clashing against creating good, interesting, exciting products. It's just about thinking about how can we prevent some of the bad things happening when people use our products, right? And so we can design them to motivate people to use them in the intended way. And that's the big challenge that we have today. And not many people think about how to do this. Instead, they just start with the product development, and then they really don't think much about the human in the end. How do we do all this? If we're interested, well, if we are interested, then we, of course, study design engineering, where you might want to come in and learn about human-centered design and basic engineering, knowledge of a wide range of topics. And of course, you might have the opportunity to take my module, which I give as an elective in year 4, where students do a design challenge. And I challenge them to take all these things into account and design products and services that are more mindful about people's behaviors and people's motivation and help to maintain that autonomy. If you're interested in Dyson School of Design Engineering, and we are a very cool bunch, you can check us out online. I'd like to thank you for listening to me. We are online. We also have a Twitter or an X account if you want to follow us there. And you can see all the cool work that's being done in the school and a wide range of multidisciplinary projects that are always done and lots of collaboration with external companies and everything. So do check us out if what I talked about today struck a bit of a chord with you. Thank you all, and good luck with whatever studies you choose. But if you're interested in design engineering, you now know where to find us. Okay, thank you.